Hello, I'm Kalyan Arangan. I'm a solution architect with Matillion. Today I will be talking about the Google Adwords component, which interacts with the Google Adwords API to retrieve data into Amazon Redshift. Let's get started. Let's start by looking at the prerequisites to work with the component. You need a Google account with access to the AdWords data, a developer token that's been authorized for production accounts, a customer ID for the account which owns the data, and a client ID and secret for OAuth registration purposes. The first thing you do, if you haven't already done that, is to register for OAuth in Matillion so that we can authenticate against your Google account. You could basically go to the project menu and manage OAuth and then follow a couple of steps in order to complete the process. The process is well documented on our support site. Search for setting up OAuth and you'll come across the necessary documentation. For Google AdWords component, you'll follow the third-party OAuth setup link for further instructions on going through the process. Once you've finished registering for OAuth, you can add a Google AdWords component to the job panel. Start by setting authentication to the OAuth entry you've registered earlier. Set a developer token and the client ID. And then choose the data source from a drop-down. I'm going to go with geo performance and then select a couple of columns that we need from that particular data source. For a list of available data sources and the columns within them, you may refer to the data model section of our documentation. The rest of the properties deal with the target table in Redshift. Start by specifying a name for the stage table. And then staging area in S3. This is just a bucket we'll use to temporarily hold the data before we push it into Redshift. And then optionally, you can choose to fill in the rest of the properties which may define your distribution style, sort key, and various other options. Once you put in the minimum required properties, you can see the components now change to green, at which point you can test it by just running that component or even by running the job if you like. By default, the component will pull data for the last 7 days. Next, we'll look at how we can retrieve data for a custom date range. I've just opened another job which basically has the start component in it. And I'll start by copying the AdWords component we've just built. So let's connect those two and bring it in line. We specify date range by setting a data filter using start date and end date pseudo columns. We call them pseudo columns because they're not part of the data model, but exist purely to help you define a date filter. These are hidden by default, and to enable them, you do need to add an entry or a connection option for pseudo columns, and the value should be asterisk equals asterisk. Click on OK, and now if you go to data source filter, add a new entry, and now you should find your start date, and then add another entry for end date. And I'm going to set that to say 7. So that's about a week's worth of data. Click on OK. And the next time you run this component, it's going to bring back data for that specific date range. Next, we'll look at parameterizing the component using variables. I'd like to parameterize the customer ID, start date, and end date so I can reuse these with other Google AdWords components I may add to this workflow. So let's start by adding some local job level variables. Start date and end date. I'll just give some defaults for these. I'll use the same default for start date and end date so that they'll always pull for just 1 day if they're not disturbed. And then select the Google AdWords component and use variables where required. For our use case, let's say we'd like to set start date and end date to yesterday's date. Anytime you run the job, it'll always run for the previous day. To do that, add a Python script component to your job. And in the script section, you can manipulate the values of these variables. For now, I'm gonna just copy a script that I've already got. So let's just see if the script works as expected. And there you can see it's setting the value that I need. And the next time I run it, or if I'm to schedule this job, every time the job runs, it's going to pull in data for the previous day. I hope that gave you a good overview of using the Google AdWords component. For more information, head over to www.matillion.com or spin up your free trial on the AWS Marketplace. Thank you very much.